Imagine this. You live in Africa, in a country with oil, gas, bauxite, diamonds, and gold. The land is fertile. The climate allows food to be grown almost year-round. Agriculture is inexpensive, and resources are abundant. You know this from childhood because you see it all around you. And yet you live in poverty. There is no money, there are few decent jobs, and most people are just getting by. The country sells something to the world, but this barely affects the lives of ordinary people. At the same time, you keep seeing the same picture over and over again. Western and Chinese partners arrive. They bring humanitarian aid, drill wells, distribute food, provide loans, hold forums, and take joint photos. Each time you are told that this is help and development. But time passes and things only get worse. Prices rise, jobs do not appear, dependence on external supplies increases, and people do not become any richer. This is not an accident. I am about to explain why Africa has received enormous sums of money from the West and China for decades and yet remains poor. Why hunger often appears precisely after reforms and investments. And why all this assistance has long turned into a large and very profitable scam. Sit back. This will soon make sense. Over the past roughly 60 years, Africa has received more external aid than any other region in the world. According to estimates by the World Bank and the OECD, since the early 1960s, more than $2 trillion have been sent to African countries in the form of loans, grants, humanitarian programs, and so-called development projects. This includes money from the governments of the United States and European Union countries, international funds, United Nations programs, private charities, religious missions, and large non-governmental organizations. At various times, dozens of development programs operated simultaneously across the continent, ranging from agricultural and education reforms to poverty and hunger reduction. Officially registered non-governmental organizations alone number in the thousands. In some countries, there are more NGOs than local schools or hospitals. Money flowed continuously and in large volumes. These flows did not stop even during crises, coups, and civil conflicts. There is, however, a crucial point. Almost none of this assistance was neutral. It was accompanied by constant lectures on how a country should live and be governed. Loans and grants were tied to political conditions. Changes to electoral laws, rewriting economic rules, public administration reforms, and demands for democratization and transparency. Donor representatives were directly involved in drafting laws, budgets, and development programs. In a number of countries, key economic decisions began to be made not according to internal priorities, but in line with the requirements of creditors and donors, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Aid turned into an instrument of pressure. If a government deviated from the recommended course, funding was frozen. If it adopted the desired decisions, the money was released. As a result, African states gradually lost control over their own economic policies. Formally, sovereignty remained intact, but key levers, budgets, agriculture, trade, and social spending were increasingly determined from outside. For ordinary people, this meant one thing. Reforms were implemented quickly, without regard for local realities, and the consequences had to be dealt with by the population itself. It was against this backdrop that China entered the picture in the early 2000s. The scale of involvement quickly became comparable. According to research centers and African governments themselves, over the past 20 years, China has directed more than $1 trillion to Africa in the form of loans, infrastructure projects, and investment programs. The main instruments have been state-owned banks, including the Export-Import Bank of China, as well as projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. Formally, this looked like an alternative to the West. No lectures about democracy, no reform requirements, no telling anyone how to live. Roads, ports, power plants, railways, fast, large-scale, and accompanied by polished presentations. At a certain point, China became Africa's largest trading partner, surpassing both the United States and the European Union. But if you look at the results, the picture barely changes. Poverty levels remain high, food dependence continues to grow, and debt burdens increase. The only difference is who the country owes money to, and who controls key infrastructure. The West operates through rules and reforms. China operates through loans and assets. For ordinary people on the ground, the outcome looks the same. Incomes do not rise, and sustainable development does not appear. For many African countries, this initially looked like salvation and an alternative to the Western model. And this is where the central question fully emerges. If both the Western aid model and the Chinese investment model have produced the same results for decades, then the problem is not that someone is not trying hard enough. It means that the very idea of externally saving Africa is designed to preserve dependency rather than eliminate it. Next, we will break down how this works in practice, at the level of specific mechanisms and decisions. It is important not to get confused here. When people say that many African countries were once self-sufficient, they are not talking about smartphones, airplanes, or German machinery. They are talking about food, about basic survival, about the fact that people knew how to feed themselves and had been doing so for decades. Villages grew maize, sorghum, cassava, and rice. People ate what they produced themselves. Farmers did not live richly, but they lived steadily. No one waited for a ship carrying humanitarian aid in order to have dinner. And most importantly, none of this required any currency at all. You do not buy food with dollars, you grow it. The problems began elsewhere. At the same time, the country exists within the global economy, and that world has its own rules. Fuel, medicine, and equipment have to be purchased. Old debts must be serviced, debts that someone once took out for development. And suddenly, it turns out that all of this requires dollars. But a country does not earn dollars from maize. It earns them from one or two export commodities: cocoa, coffee, copper, oil, whatever it happens to have. As long as prices for these commodities are stable, the system somehow works. But once the market so much as sneezes, the trouble begins. Prices fall, exports decline, and foreign currency dries up. The country has food, but no dollars. And without dollars, it cannot service its debts, buy fuel, or import medicine. At that point, the government realizes that there are very few options. Private banks will not lend. No one wants to credit a borrower with an empty cash register. One address remains: the International Monetary Fund. And that is where the government turns. The IMF arrives like an emergency service, but it immediately warns. We will stabilize you, but after that, we will treat you according to our protocol. The money comes quickly, and that matters. The country does not collapse today, but along with the money comes a list of conditions. And this is where things get truly interesting. Because from that moment on, the country begins to be reshaped, not so that people can calmly eat their own food, but so that it becomes convenient for debt repayment and external trade. A little later, the World Bank enters the process. If the IMF is emergency care that prevents a country from collapsing right now, then the World Bank is more like a lifestyle doctor. It arrives with the idea of long-term treatment and a complete restructuring of the entire system. The proposal is to redesign the economy as a whole. How the country trades, what it produces, what agriculture should focus on, how the energy sector operates, and how much the state can afford overall. It is important to be clear about this from the outset. This is not aid and not rescue. It is a financial transaction. Money is provided in exchange for reshaping the country. Not partially, not carefully, but entirely, so that the economy becomes convenient and safe for creditors and external players. That is the essence of the contract. The conditions are fairly standard. The state is required to abandon subsidies for local farmers, cut social spending, open markets to external players, and sell off state assets. Everything that was previously controlled domestically is gradually pushed onto the market. Formally, this is done in the name of efficiency. In practice, it removes restrictions on external capital. After that, foreign companies can enter freely, buying enterprises, infrastructure, licenses, and resource deposits, without significant barriers and without the state acting as a market participant. Privatization is the key element in this scheme. It provides quick cash in the short term, figures that look good in reports. At the same time, the country loses control over assets that generate income for decades. Subsidies are removed because they interfere with the market. Markets are opened because it makes trade easier. Everything looks tidy when viewed from the perspective of a creditor and its spreadsheets. For the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, this is a logical and coherent framework. But this is where things become more interesting. For this economic model to function at all, it requires the right laws and the right decisions. And that means politics enters the picture. Loans and assistance are almost always accompanied by demands for political change. Not just any change, but changes that guarantee the continuation of the chosen course. This includes trade rules, investment regimes, property laws, and limits on the role of the state. As a result, a circle of loyal politicians and administrators emerges. People who implement the required reforms, continue borrowing, and maintain the same model. In return, they gain access to financing, external support, personal benefits, and future opportunities abroad. Everything is legal, everything is documented, everything is presented as reforms and development. The cost, however, is borne by ordinary people. They are the ones who face rising prices, reduced support, job losses, and growing dependence on imports. They are the ones who repay the debts through taxes, tariffs, and declining living standards. And this is where it becomes clear why, despite such massive volumes of aid and investment, the outcome for most of the population barely changes. The model is designed from the outset to benefit creditors and external markets, not the country that enters it. If this sounds too abstract, it is enough to look at concrete examples. Malawi once fed itself. Its staple crop was maize. Small farmers grew it for the domestic market. The state subsidized seeds and fertilizers and maintained grain reserves. The country was poor, but it did not experience mass hunger. In the late 1990s, after agreements with the International Monetary Fund, subsidies were declared inefficient, the Grain Marketing Board was privatized, and farmer support was dismantled. Almost immediately, yields fell, reserves disappeared, and maize prices began to rise. By 2002, the country faced a severe food crisis. Hunger emerged not because of a lack of land or people, but after agriculture had been restructured to meet reform requirements. Most telling of all, when the authorities partially restored subsidies a few years later, yields rose sharply, and the country was once again able to feed itself. The experiment was both clear and painful. A similar logic played out in Ghana, though more gradually and over a longer period. Until the 1980s, the country largely provided for itself in food. Cassava, yams, maize, and rice were grown domestically. After entering structural adjustment programs under the guidance of the World Bank and the IMF, the focus shifted toward exports. Cocoa became the priority, while the domestic market was relegated to second place. Farmer support was reduced, and markets were open to imports. Export figures improved, and reports looked positive. But over time, the country became increasingly dependent on imported food, and notably, food from the United States. By the early 2000s, Ghana was already importing a significant share of its rice and other basic staples from the US. Food prices became tied to global markets, and any external shock was immediately felt in household budgets. There was no formal famine for a long time, but chronic undernourishment and vulnerability became the norm. At this point, it becomes clear that this is not about random mistakes or unfortunate coincidences. The pattern repeats itself. A country that was capable of feeding itself is drawn into a model where the priorities are debt servicing, exports, and open markets. Against this backdrop, China long appeared as a savior. No lectures, no talk about democracy, no moralizing. No one asks about your elections, who your president is, or how your opposition is organized. China arrives with a simple formula. We provide the money, you build. Roads, ports, power plants, railways, fast, large scale, with ribbon cuttings and photo opportunities. For countries exhausted by Western conditions, this felt like a breath of fresh air. The money comes in the form of infrastructure loans. The main sources are Chinese state banks, primarily the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank. Projects are often framed within the Belt and Road Initiative. Formally, everything sounds attractive. Development, connectivity, growth in trade. In practice, the structure is such that the country takes out the loan, but construction is almost always carried out by Chinese contractors, using Chinese equipment, materials, and labor. A significant portion of the funds flows straight back to China. There are indeed no demands to rewrite the entire economy or abolish subsidies, but there is another condition. Collateral. Loans are secured by future revenues or specific assets. Ports, railways, power plants, resource deposits. If a project fails to generate returns or the economy falters, the debt does not disappear. Instead, it begins to be serviced through strategic assets. The most well-known example involves ports. In a number of countries, China has obtained long-term control over port infrastructure because governments were unable to fully service their debts. Formally, this is not confiscation. Everything is governed by contracts. In reality, the country loses control over the nodes through which trade and foreign currency flows pass. This is not colonialism in the old sense, but it is also not an equal partnership. At the same time, debt dependence grows. Chinese loans are often backed by state guarantees, meaning they fall on the national budget. In any crisis or revenue downturn, the country once again faces a familiar choice. Either cut spending or negotiate restructuring. And at that point, it becomes clear that the range of alternatives is limited. The projects have already been built, the money has been spent, and servicing the debt will take decades. A separate issue is dependence on contractors. Even the maintenance of infrastructure often remains in the hands of Chinese companies. Spare parts, specialists, modernization, all of it is tied to a single partner. As a result, the country may receive a road or a power plant, but it does not gain independence. Without Chinese involvement, the system simply does not function. Here, it is important not to fall into illusions. China is neither worse nor better than the West. It simply operates differently. The West takes control through rules, reforms, and economic policy. China does so through infrastructure, debt, and physical assets. For ordinary people, the difference is barely noticeable. A job may appear on a construction site, but dependency remains. The economy becomes connected, but not independent. That is why the Chinese model is not an alternative to Western aid, but another version of the same dependency. Without lectures or values, but with the same outcome. And from here, it is logical to ask the final question. Why, with so many external partners, does Africa still fail to break out of this cycle? And who actually benefits from keeping it there? This leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. If we strip away emotions and fine words, who truly benefits from Africa becoming strong and independent? The answer is simple, and precisely for that reason deeply unsettling. Almost no external actor does. A strong Africa is a competitor. These would be countries that process their own raw materials, sell finished products themselves, protect their own markets, and set their own terms. That is competition for Western corporations, for Chinese manufacturers, for global agribusiness giants. It means millions of jobs created locally rather than somewhere overseas. In such an Africa, you can no longer simply arrive and buy everything cheaply. An independent Africa is also an inconvenient partner. It is harder to deal with it through ultimatums. It does not rush to open its markets at the first demand, does not accept any credit terms offered, and does not hand over strategic assets in exchange for promises of investment. It negotiates, refuses, and sets its own rules. For the global system, this is undesirable because predictability disappears. A poor Africa, by contrast, is the ideal scenario. It is a consumer market where food, fuel, equipment, and medicine can be sold. It is a source of cheap raw materials exported without deep processing. It is political influence purchased through loans, humanitarian aid, and infrastructure projects. These are countries dependent on external decisions and unable to pursue a long-term strategy. In such a model, aid ceases to be a tool for development. It becomes a way of maintaining a balance in which weakness is preserved, but not allowed to collapse completely. Just enough for the system to keep functioning. Just enough so that every new crisis once again leads to loans, reforms, investments, and yet another aid package. That is why, over decades, nothing fundamentally changes. Donors change, slogans change, formats change. The essence remains the same. Africa is not being developed. It is being serviced. It is kept in a condition where it does not fall apart, but also does not break free. From this follows the central conclusion that is rarely spoken aloud. In this system, aid is meant to preserve weakness, not eliminate it. Because a strong and independent Africa carries too many risks and too few conveniences for the outside world. And as long as this logic remains the foundation, talk of salvation and development will sound appealing, while the result will remain unchanged.